Thank you, Ajay, and thanks to the organizers, Sarita, for putting something like this together. I think it's high time that we began to privilege and discuss what might be called alternate practices, practices that otherwise in the mainstream, especially in today's India, I don't think are getting attention. And therefore, there are narratives missing in our discourse about architecture, which I think a conference like this can help construct. Because I think this difference or this swing, the balance, say, between architecture being a social and a fine art is lost. It's sort of moving, it's being co-opted much more by the space of fine art, where it becomes autonomous. It becomes an autonomous product from the society that it's supposed to serve. And I think the social purpose of architecture is really crucial, which is what I think a conference like this can remind us about. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here for the day. I hope the questions that emerge would be helpful and really seminal for our discussions as we sort of go along, and how through seeing the kind of transformative practices that I think we have put together for presentations today, I think this would be really very, very interesting. And thanks once again to Ajay and Sarita for facilitating this. In discussing this, when we were talking about design as social capital and how does one frame this, I mean, we looked at the word agency, because design as social agency also resonates in completely different ways. But you know, the few questions that came up, which I think we should hold at the back of our mind as we look at the different presentations, is the question of ethical intelligence, because that becomes much broader in terms of how one can frame and look at projects. Because the ethical dimension, I think, it's used in many other contexts, but I think to use it in architecture and in the social questions related to architecture becomes very, very important. And I think the practitioners that you're going to see today are people who engage with problems that bother them. For example, they surround the problem, which means they don't come to the problem with singular lenses, but with this notion of multiple perspectives, which is, again, an interesting shift. And of course, ethics naturally embraces questions of do no harm, make things better in very simplistic but profound ways. The question of rights and where they come from, the question of confidentiality in the ethical sense. And I think really what it points to, which I hope we will go away with today, is the idea of responsibility that comes with knowledge. We are using knowledge often not in responsible ways. And I think this is a question, for me, that is very, very important in listening to people presenting in this conference through the day. Because the narratives that are being constructed unknowingly, whether it's the narrative of the global city, we are all embracing this idea of making Delhi and Mumbai a global city. I think inherent in those narratives are frames and traps that we're limited by, in a sense. And so how does one broaden this? And therefore the question of ethics, the responsibility that comes with knowledge, these are complex questions, but I think these could become interesting ways of framing or critically looking at what we are going to see. Because design excellence and social responsibility together, I think, then opens up many other models of engagement and practice which are important. And lastly, design has to be situated in the center of this discussion, because design is really the synthetic mode. You know, I mean, even the business schools around the world use the word design thinking, because really it is about synthesis. It's about being able to bring the different forces and give them form, or give the built environment form. And I think the multiplicity of forces and the narratives that inform them is, I think, the more we can embrace and be challenged by, the richer will be the products that we look at. So with that, let me sort of jump into, and this was a request. I would have, if I had the choice, I would have just framed this more conceptually, but the organizers were insistent, I think rightly so, that look, why don't you share projects? Why don't you actually show, because we are all showing projects, let's talk about how you might sort of situate these questions. And so I want to start with this sort of diagram, which is a diagram of urban India. And this is important because I think one of the things that we as a profession have limited ourselves to is our imagination based on the megacity or the territories that we are really familiar with. And this is what is happening in India. The real time bomb is about 392 cities that are maybe 50,000 people today, 100,000, all projected to become up to 1 million people. So if in the worst, well, not the worst, but in the extreme situation, you could have 400 million Indians living in places we don't even talk about, because collectively we probably can't go beyond 35 or 50 names of towns. And I think this is very critical, because what this does is it tells us that there's a whole territory here which is evolving through a different set of procedures and protocols that our pedagogy and even our imagination as professionals is not equipping us to engage with. And of course, the obvious ruptures that are existing in our urban landscape, the kind of polarities of form, of economic groups, the binaries that begin to exist in this landscape are only too obvious. And the highlight of this is, of course, the question of social inequity. You know, the world's biggest dwelling and the world's smallest occupation, which happen in the same space. So this incredible polarization and inequity is something that we don't have the narratives, in a sense, to address. So the profession really is been marginalized. And I think this marginalization of the profession is largely because of a few reasons. But the two that I really think are very important is, one is the impatience of capital, which is what we've had to deal with in the last 20 years. And this is for me the landscape of impatient capital. Dubai, Shanghai, these are places that make the arrival of capital and its expression frictionless. And we celebrate these as efficient places. Singapore is another example, but it creates a landscape of impatient capital. And don't fool yourself, architects have no rail. Between the engineers and the vendors, those buildings get twisted and taken higher and higher and higher. Architects play a very kind of cosmetic role in this process. And so our profession has been challenged squarely with the force of capital and its impatience to find expression, and we don't know how to. And society, of course, is completely a non-existent issue in this discussion, and it gets completely marginalized. So that's one more contemporary force. The other force that we are dealing with is a question of aesthetic, because there has been a massive, in our post-independent era, there has been an incredible rupture in the cultural as well as in the landscape of aesthetics and representation. Because essentially in India, what happened, as in many other parts of the world, is aesthetic modernity arrived here before the social modernization project. And so we began to embrace, through Corbusier, Nehru, who patronized Corbusier, a young generation of charismatic architects who embraced modernity, modernism, the aesthetics of modernism, for very good reasons at that moment. But if you look at it in retrospect, it created some profound drawn project. But you can see they need 10 million liters a year for 100 elephants. We've already achieved 20 million liters just in phase one by using the landscape as the integral. And of course the housing too, it's 40 square meters per family. And by creating configurations of a hierarchy of courtyards, you expand the house 5 times subvertively, because they get much more space, so that they have much more space to live. And of course one concentrated on the architecture and all of that, which was problematic. And elephants also come in small, medium, large, extra large, so we had to test out the sizes. And that's what it looks like. Right now, they're not allowing anyone to transform the houses. This is essentially low-cost housing. I'm hoping once the 100 mahouts move in there, about 50 have moved in, they might actually take ownership and transform it and paint it and make it their own. For us, the emphasis wasn't the architecture, although we were very careful about how the elephant can watch the children play, the mahouts' children, because they begin to build a relationship with them. The than, where the elephants live, is also used to store the material for their food, so it insulates it. Every community has altered their own thans differently, bringing their own cultural sensibilities to it. That's what it looked like when we just finished the housing. That's what it's looking like a year ago. With this monsoon, it'll transform more. We are planting more aggressively. And it's interesting. Because of the water, the poorest in Jaipur actually have lawns and bougainvillea, and where the middle class are getting tankers just for drinking water. So this asymmetry that exists actually gets completely flipped over and this is through design, really, that you've privileged. By privileging the landscape, the resource of water, you actually empower people. Architecture then actually is not the important thing. So sometimes we have to learn that we always go for the architecture because that's the frame we can think of. If we have to embrace society and transformation, these are many complex trade-offs that we have to really work with. The outdoor spaces get used. Life is beginning to take over, with the goats coexisting now with the elephants. And now we are stitching together little schemes for culverts just to make efficient the water management. Because this relationship between the elephant and the mahout was the heart of the project. And the act of bathing is important. This is the second water body that's just been finished. And you can see the whole environment is slowly sort of transforming. There's a video. And the whole environment is transforming. This is actually from the site. Some parts of the site have transformed so dramatically from what was really a desert. So These are the social pavilions. Now tourists are coming. That's creating an economy for these people. So now there is a whole ecology, not only a natural ecology, but an ecology which is about economy. So this is supplementing the income of the mahouts because it's become an attractive place for young tourists to come to ride the elephants, photograph the elephants, etc. And now we are working with the government, and these are self-initiated, where we're proposing to them, do a visitor center. We are trying to sell the idea to them. There were some broken buildings which we have restored with a small budget to create a school for the children of the mahouts, because now with 100 families there, there's going to be another generation that is going to live there. So I just want to sort of end with this, that I think if we have to make this intersection with society, we have to also question the frames and the narratives we use to describe our own understanding of the landscape that we work in. We dwell often in tactics. We show off by saying how we managed to subvert the system to get through some loopholes. But we have forgotten to think more strategically and more broadly within these ideas of broader ecologies, which are not only natural ecologies, but also ecologies that very much involve society at the heart of it. Thank you very much.